listening to the Philanthropisms podcast with Rodri Davis. Hello, you're listening to the Philanthropisms podcast. This is the podcast where we try to put philanthropy in context. I'm your host, as ever, Rod Davis, and this week we are in conversation with Elizabeth Barajas-Román. Now, Elizabeth is the president and CEO of the Women's Funding Network, which is the largest philanthropic network in the world devoted to gender equity and justice. Before that, she was CEO of the Solidago Foundation, and she's also been CEO of the Women's Fund of Western Massachusetts. So I sat down fairly recently with Elizabeth to talk about her work at WFN and also more broadly about what it means to be a feminist funder, how prevalent the ideas of feminist funding are within philanthropy and whether that's spreading, and some wider issues about kind of funding gender equity issues and also social movements. So yeah, we talked about a lot of things in a broad-ranging conversation. As I say, we talked about kind of what it means to be a feminist funder and whether that was something that only applied to organisations that are funding gender equity and feminist issues, or whether there are principles that could be applied more broadly, and how WFN was trying to do that in their work. We talked about intersectionality and whether when funding women's issues and gender issues, how necessary it is to take an intersectional approach and kind of recognise multiple different senses that people have identity as individuals, and whether that sometimes presents challenges in terms of targeting funding versus kind of making it universal, or whether that's actually a false dichotomy. We talked about Roe v. Wade and the rollback on Roe v. Wade and abortion rights and reproductive rights in the US, and what impact that was having on philanthropy in the US, but also outside the US on organisations that are working around issues of gender equity, whether they were seeing knock-on effects, and also what the lessons are from the rollback of Roe v. Wade for philanthropy more broadly in terms of what it should be doing now, or what it perhaps hasn't been doing enough of in the past. We also talked about social movements and some of the opportunities around foundations funding social movements, but also some of the challenges when well-resourced funders come to the table with small, often resource-poor organisations, and whether those power imbalances can create challenges. We also talked about participatory methods of grant making, which is something that has been around for a long time within the feminist movement and kind of gender movements more broadly, and what the potential was for those, how much of that we're seeing, and kind of how much we will see that grow, I think, as kind of mainstream funders come on board. So without further ado, let's get into the conversation. It's a really interesting one. I hope you really enjoy it. I certainly did. And I will be back at the end just for the usual couple of bits of notes and housekeeping. Okay, great. Well, I'm here with Elizabeth Barajas-Román. Hi, Elizabeth.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good, thank you. It's great to have you on the show. So for those listening, Elizabeth is the president and CEO of the Women's Funding Network. Maybe the best place to start before we go into what I'm sure will be a kind of much more detailed conversation is just for you to say a bit about what the Women's Funding Network is and what you do there and how the organisation came about.
Sure. So the Women's Funding Network is the largest association, the largest alliance of gender justice funders and women's funds globally. So we are an alliance that brings together the thought leadership, the research, and the influence and power of funders who are working specifically thinking about intersectional feminism and thinking about how funding moves to communities through a gender lens.
Yeah, and I'd love to pick up on some of that and sort of unpack some of the differences between what it means to be a sort of gender justice focused funder and also what it means to be a feminist funder. I mean, maybe we could start there. And I know something you've sort of spoken and written about before. What for you does it mean to be a feminist funder, and kind of what are the principles involved in that can be applied even beyond organizations that maybe don't have gender as their core focus?
Well, maybe that goes a little bit to your previous question around how we were founded and started. We are about a 40-year-old organization, and we started right around the same time as many other feminist grant making was starting. It was also around the same time as a movement around affinity funding was starting in the philanthropic sector. It was a response to the kind of moment where the idea around philanthropy and how money was moving in spaces was very top down, and it was those in leadership were not representative of those who were kind of being impacted by those resources. So there was a movement in philanthropy at the time to really think about what are some affinity spaces. They were sometimes called alternative funds, and they either focused on geographic, they focused on racial or ethnic makeup, and the idea around what it was to specifically focus on women and girls and funding women and girls was something that was coming up around that time as well. And the idea around it takes more than just kind of funding issues around women and girls, but that feminist funding is a fundamental idea around redistributing money as a mechanism for just redistributing power. So it was kind of moving beyond charity and thinking about resource movement as a way to actually shift systems and shift the influence of different agendas so that they can be controlled by activists, by communities, by people who are most impacted around this kind of resource redistribution. So I want to say, so feminist funding or feminist principles are, the kind of laying out of them are around about 40 years old in the philanthropic sector. And it's again, this fundamental idea that money and the movement of money needs to be centered in community, and that it is a mechanism for redistributing power. It's also an invitation, I want to say, to funders to be really thoughtful about how power it moves in purposeful grant making. And so it goes beyond kind of people's portfolios to say that they are doing, working in a gender portfolio, or that their dollars are moving towards specifically named women and girls. What it is an invitation to think about power.
No, I was going to pick up on that point, because one thing I wanted to ask is how much of your work is kind of specifically with organizations that have as their cause funding kind of gender issues or women's issues. How much of it was with groups that are kind of affinity or identity based that are comprised of women, and how much of it is with other funders who maybe, neither of those things apply, but they're interested in applying a gender lens or the principles of kind of feminist funding to their work. And have you seen that change over time?
The majority of our network are U.S.-based women's funds, and these are women's funds kind of sit in a special place in philanthropy in that they're activist-based, they're community-based, they raise dollars and grant dollars, and they are usually started in community by activists and who are interested in moving dollars to address the specific issues that are important to their community around women and families. So the majority of our network is comprised of women's funds, but I want to say probably about 20% are and growing are a group of funders who cover a wide variety of issues, who are starting to see the importance of thinking about gender lens at the intersection of the work that they do. A good portion of that 20% are large global foundations that maybe have an interest in thinking about how gender lens might be important to their strategies on economic mobility, on poverty, on climate change. And what we see part of our work in this ecosystem is doing is bringing about kind of making sure that percentage grows. The people, the organizations, the funders who are maybe not thinking specifically on moving dollars towards women and girls per se, but bring a gender lens to their existing strategies and find it important to think about and talk to and be in community with other funders who are expanding that frame as well.
Yeah, just really interesting to hear. And you mentioned before that sort of the majority of the network is US based funding organizations. How much of the work, either on the sort of the funding side or on the recipient side, that you do has an international flavor to it as well?
Yeah, so I would say it's about 60% are based in the US and fund in the US. And the other portion are global. They fund partially in the US and outside of the US. And a smaller portion, I would say probably about 5%, are exclusively outside of the US based funding. Based funders, I should say. And what we do is we partner really closely with other networks who are global networks and working outside the US so that we can really have that cross issue, cross regional, cross global, cross country support.
And when you do that, to what extent do you find that the sort of issues around gender equity and women's rights and things that you're working on are common across those different areas, and to what extent are there kind of differences? Do they apply fairly universally, or do you see quite significant differences of context?
So I think number one, the issue around gender disparity exists all over the world. I mean, there's not a single place in the world that where women are doing as well as, or doing better than their male counterparts. So it exists every single place in the world. There are places that are doing much better, and we see that through other. There's research and data around where those countries are. So there are countries that are doing better in a lot of the different metrics that are important around women and families and gender equity. And again, we want to make sure to point out that when we talk about gender equity, we're not specifically just talking about women and men. We're talking about how gender plays a role in disparate outcomes for people in their communities. So yeah, so there are countries that are doing better. There are locations that are doing better. There are policies that we are part of a coalition that is working around feminist foreign policy, for example, where there's countries that are taking on a policy lens to gender equity and thinking about how feminist principles play out even in the foreign policy realm. However, but in the places where I think there's other places where are doing better. There's some surprises as well. Even where we see some progressive policies in the philanthropy sector, I find it surprising where there's some areas where gender is barely mentioned, even though some of the outcomes, on the surface, doing better than maybe U.S. context or some other contexts. I find that in philanthropy, even after kind of the onset of feminist funding principles 40 years ago, in different global contexts, it's talking about gender, or even saying the word gender, is still quite controversial, which I find somewhat surprising. So I think, the universal thing here is that women are, and gender inequities exist all over the world. There does seem to be a cross-cutting aversion. There still seems to be kind of a bit of a third rail about talking about gender, especially in the philanthropic sector. So I find that surprising and also concerning. And I think there's some easy answers here on how we can change that.
And one thing I wanted to ask actually is you mentioned before that an important element of your work in working on these issues is around taking an intersectional approach. What can you say a bit about what that means in the context of your work to adopt an approach like that?
Well, I think one of the things that's super important and I've been in philanthropy for 20 years, in both private philanthropy and large international foundations. And one of the things that we're always talking about, I know we were talking about being at some similar spaces earlier in the year, data is always kind of held up as king. Whereas, look at the data, know about the problem, understand the completeness of the problem in order to be able to build strategies that are effective, right? That's one of the kind of, I want to say, almost biblical kind of statements that people want to talk about when we were talking about philanthropy or in philanthropy. But what's interesting to me, again, is the sidestepping of the understanding around intersectional lenses, right? So there's an aversion to saying, yes, we want data. Yes, we want to know the completeness of a problem, but we don't want to look at it from all of those different sections, right? We don't want to think about climate and also think about how gender plays a role. We don't want to think about poverty or economic mobility and think about how women's leadership or the oppression of women and gender non-binary people is impacting the ability to move forward and to live healthy and complete lives. So I think that's an interesting place for philanthropy to think about, because when we say intersectional, we're not trying to overcomplicate. We're really trying to look at the completeness of the problem, both women and men and across the gender spectrum. No one lives single issue lives. And what we're saying is to have a strategy that is effective, to really think about shifting systems. We need to take a lens that incorporates the completeness of human lives and break down those silos that are artificial silos.
Yeah, absolutely. And do you ever find in the work that you're doing that obviously brings huge kind of benefits in terms of being far more kind of relevant and responsive to the needs of those particular intersectional communities? But are there ever sort of challenges where you find that people's particular experience within one intersectional community, elements of that are specific to their experience and don't necessarily relate as much to the experience of other people kind of within the wider community that you're trying to work with? And how do you sort of balance the need to focus specifically on the needs of that one potentially relatively small community against some of those more universal issues and kind of deploy your resources accordingly?
I think that's what you're describing, I think, is one of the kind of greatest false kind of logic we apply in philanthropy. We think about, we're always talking about scale. We're always talking about how are we approaching a strategy that is the broadest strategy to impact the largest group of people. And we think about that from a lens of, well, I guess it has to, we can't focus on the most marginalized group within certain, if we're talking, for example, poverty. We can't talk about the impact of a trans mother, who is unable to work because of biases and is, not housed. We can't look at something that specific because we're trying to impact broadly, right? And what we try to challenge in feminist philanthropy is to say it is in fact looking at the challenges to mobility, to again living a full and complete and thriving life for those most marginalized that allows us to find solutions to the broadest number of people. What we're saying is you find that solution that is able to say, this, family that composes of, a trans mother who is, now able to go back to school, is able to get housed, is able to now, find permanent support around childcare. You find the solutions there, and you are absolutely going to find solutions to what might be considered more mainstream and or a broader group of individuals within that particular target group. And that theory around that and how that's happening there's data behind that. It's proven to be true everywhere. There has been deep systemic shift around some of the most intractable issues in our society. When we see actual shifts there, we actually see the application of this framing, right? Of this intersectional framing of this look at the most marginalized and the most impacted by gender oppression. And you will find the solutions for everyone, right? We see that across the world where this has been applied. We see this in the global South, where we're talking about reproductive health and rights. The way that funding has been moved there from a feminist lens has made broad social impact for everyone in those communities. So yeah, we do think that it is in fact looking at the most marginalized that then has an impact to the broadest whole.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So sort of challenging it as almost a sort of false dichotomy to say that, that you need to think about a trade-off between the specific and the broader. And actually it's by being willing to focus properly on addressing the specific needs of the most marginalized that you learn the things that then allow you to address needs more broadly. I think really, really fascinating. I wanted to ask, in terms of the actual kind of work that you do as a network, is your role largely to kind of bring together members who are doing their own funding and to allow kind of knowledge exchange and peer learning, or are you also helping them to kind of administer funds, and what sort of role do you play in doing that, if so?
Yeah, so we cover it's 5 different kind of pillars of work. Number 1 is principles and practice. We believe it's important to, in a lot of the questions you're asking now around what is feminist funding? What does it look like? How do you practice it? There are modern movements in philanthropy that started within women's funds and in this gender funding, feminist funding movement that are now very mainstream, but are rarely pulled back to where they started, which was in the feminist movement, things like participatory grant making, grassroots grant making, things like that, which are now, again, more mainstream, but are often not kind of identified as having started and birthed within the women's and the feminist funding movements. We believe it's our role to make sure that those, not only are the principles continue to evolve, continue to have a rigorous kind of examination of what their impact is, but we believe it's our role to also expand the practice of those principles and make sure that people are understanding that that is in fact feminist funds that are kind of the incubator of some of these practices and are supporting that incubation. So that's one of our pieces around principles and practice. The other piece is capacity building. We know that feminist funds, as I mentioned, they're both kind of activists and doing the work on the ground, as well as helping resource the work on the ground. And they're incubating new ways of philanthropic practice. We know that there's not a really great way for them to match up, and intersectional work that they do, it's not a really great way to match up with a lot of philanthropy out there, existing philanthropy. So what we do is we make sure that our alliance is supported through capacity building, and that sometimes looks like direct grants to the field. An example is during COVID, there were a lot of our feminist funds that were in danger of closing. Some funds that took 40 years to build up were in danger of not existing, and sometimes they were the only funders that were funding these grassroots groups within their communities. So our role was to make sure that they kept their doors open, so to speak, and continue to evolve during an unprecedented time in our history. So capacity building is the other piece. We also do capacity building around as those feminist funders grow, as they learn, all of that, we make sure that there's learning and pieces there. But a big part of that is moving some dollars to help support that. Strategy development is our third kind of pillar. We work as an alliance, so we're not just kind of a membership organization per se, where people just kind of come and a loose kind of a network of folks. We really believe that the power behind our alliance is around developing strategy for the field. And that looks like specific projects, that looks like partnerships, that looks like strategic partnerships with, across the field, cross-sector partnerships. So that strategy development is an important third pillar. The fourth pillar is the influence and amplification. It's things like this. It's talking to folks who are not sure what this looks like, not sure of the impact that feminist funding does, making sure that the data that our members are collecting and building and learning, that learning is pulled back into our sector to have to do more and better grants to the field. And the last one is that knowledge and research. We've done quite a bit around working with existing very large kind of repositories of knowledge, either at universities or at large institutions like in the U.S. Candid, which is one of the largest institutions kind of gathering data. We work with them to make sure that the data they're collecting is coded correctly, has some ability to be able to be disaggregated. We work with governments and the type of census pieces they're pulling together. So knowledge and research is not just about our research. It's really about thinking about the field and making sure that we are truly measuring what's important and able to report that out. So those are the 5 big pieces.
Yeah, really interesting to hear. One thing I wanted to ask, actually, because obviously a lot of your work, I would imagine, certainly on the side of the recipient organizations, focuses around social movements and sort of grassroots organizations rather than necessarily very large nonprofits. And obviously those organizations need and want more resources. But I know there are kind of concerns historically and now that when that happens, there are dangers that come even when sort of well-intentioned funders step into these fields without understanding some of the power dynamics and the issues, and you get dangers of movement capture or funders kind of funding things but stipulating that you need to soften the edges or not take such confrontational approaches. Have you seen any issues around that, and what kind of work have you done to try and educate funders, but also to make sure that those situations don't happen from the point of view of the movements?
That's a really good question. And it's one we've been facing both with, specifically here in the US around reproductive health and abortion access. 17 of our members sit in states that are where abortion is criminalized and their lives are threatened for even speaking about it. So they look to WFN plays that role where we are both helping support capacity around digital security and other types of security. Also by, I want to say, helping to transform and bridge to funding to those organizations that might be impossible to have been done in the setting that they're in now. And I want to give a shout out to our sister organization, Prospera, which is a very similar organization in terms of their alliance of gender funds and feminist funds. I believe that between the two of our networks, big role is again transforming and bridging philanthropic dollars to the grassroots through these through our members, right? And being able to deal with very in conflict zones, things, really dangerous situations where kind of standing up and saying this is what we're doing or this is how we're moving dollars to movement would put them in danger, so to speak, right? So in real danger. So there's kind of a range between that and being able to be that intermediary between getting resources there, as well as kind of best practice, advice, bringing, experts and legal experts, security experts, bringing all of those kinds of capacities that are necessary for as things are dynamic and changing, being able to get that to our members as the world is changing and on fire in different places. We're able to move that quickly so that they can stay nimble, which is what's needed on the ground for dollars to stay nimble and flexible, which allows them to focus on that while we kind of take the big hits, I want to say, on that. And I think that's one of our key roles in the ecosystem. And I want to say it's also one of the key roles I know that our sister fund, our sister organization, Prospera, does. And they focus on funders that are in the global South and global East. So it's a big role there. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned there, I mean, the current situation in the US around kind of abortion rights and birth control and the overturning of Roe v. Wade, and I kind of partial overturning. I mean, I ask this as someone who is not based in the US and has, the knowledge of an outsider about it. But from the point of view of philanthropy and particularly kind of gender-focused philanthropy in the US, do you think there's a sense in which that has come as a real sort of shock to the system that shows both that maybe there's an element of sort of complacency in the mainstream nonprofit world, that social change and social progress is something that sort of once won, we can kind of move on to the next thing, and that actually that isn't always the case? And also, does it suggest that there is a fundamental tension maybe between the sort of the natural incrementalism of a lot of mainstream funding and nonprofit work and the sort of the urgency and radicalism of grassroots movements that are sort of saying, actually, we need to do this faster and we need to take, much more fundamental steps to make sure this sort of thing doesn't happen?
So it's a big question, and one that it is well, one of the things that we know is that, as I mentioned before, the reason why WFN even exists, the reason why feminist funds exist and continue, where gender is still kind of not brought up. You can look around a room and see that the people who are leading different grassroots movements, that are leading and innovating at the pace and at the impact that funders want to see, are women of color-led organizations, are people who are taking this tact. But what we know is that the funding that has gone to these organizations has basically been unchanged since 1970, right? So it's been less than 1% of the dollars that have moved from in global philanthropy. When you look at the way governments even move in the terms of the dollars to gender, it's been unchanged. So when we talk about what's the complacency here, it is the gender and the role that the gender inequity and gender oppression plays in the movement of society forward, and the healing of the ills that philanthropy is looking to solve for, has never been taken seriously and continues not to be taken seriously. So was there a surprise that because it's never been, it's not taken seriously, has never, the investment has not changed since, in fact, women's funds are kind of, they're raising dollars and moving dollars because there is no broad philanthropic investment in gender and in the work that, and the issues that take a gender lens, right? It tells you that there's something deeply wrong. And the evidence is we've lost, right? This is the evidence of how if you're not funding it, and the people who were funding work against women's rights here in the US were actively and increasingly funding that work. And so when you look at the data, you look at where the investments were going, it should not be a surprise that the rollback of individual rights and bodily autonomy is happening very real here in the very, very concretely here in the US, because that is where the money is going. And so when taking from that philanthropic lens, it's not always true that what we fund is successful, but certainly what you don't fund will be very hard. It will be very difficult to move forward and to hold ground. And so I think if there's a lesson here, it's that the gender inequity and gender oppression needs to be taken seriously by those who value a just and thriving society, right? And the impact of the rollback of Roe v. Wade here in the U.S., we're seeing that as almost a permissiveness in our global partners as well, where people are kind of taking another look at how they're thinking about talking about bodily autonomy. And I'm thinking about that broadly because we know that the same funders who funded the rollback of bodily autonomy here in the U.S. for women, for ability to determine whether or not you have a child, are the same funders who are also funding anti-gender work and anti-trans work around the world. So again, it's not we shouldn't be surprised that this is the case, and I don't necessarily see that same sort of kind of we solved it, now we're done sort of thing happening in other aspects of philanthropy. So I just think there was a general sense that there wasn't taken seriously, that gender hasn't been taken seriously. And it's just really time for that to change. Yeah, I'll stop there.
No, it's really interesting. And interesting, but also concerning to hear what you're saying there about the way in which it's potentially having ramifications internationally, because that was certainly something I was going to ask about, whether just the sort of awareness of what's gone on in the US context was having an impact on your work elsewhere. But it sounds like it's almost potentially presenting new challenges if some of those funders that have been behind pushing back on those sort of hard-won rights are seeking to do the same elsewhere as well. I just a few other things I wanted to ask because I'm aware I'm in danger of taking up too much of your time. I mean, one was I know you wrote something recently for Alliance, I think, about collective models of giving and giving circles, and it's something I've talked recently on the podcast to a few other people about. So I'd be really interested in your sense of whether the kind of the focus on gender issues and women, and particularly sort of solidarity and identity-based funding, whether that kind of lends itself particularly well to those kind of collective models, and whether those models themselves are kind of better at putting forward an idea of philanthropy that is more focused on justice, or that can move resources in a way that genuinely sort of shifts power as well as just money.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a democratization that comes with the collective giving that I believe is really, really important for unlocking kind of where we talk about our feminist principles are really about how are we thinking about power. And when we are able to broaden the definition of who's a philanthropist, I believe that fundamentally shifts power in people's minds. I think there is something that is truly remarkable that happens in a person when they see themselves as someone who is able to use resources and time and their thought leadership to help shape the society they live in, right? And we do that in a variety of ways. It's why we feel so great about voting when we vote. But I think that the other piece is philanthropy, right? And helping to do that and doing that alongside other people who have that same vision of change in the world. Again, is also very, very powerful. You're not alone out there, right? You're able to combine your resources to be able to have have an impact. We know that if you combine all the private philanthropy in the world, it really doesn't really even have a hill of beans really to the to what governments move, and it's actually really, really small compared to and also the scope of the problem, right? Or the scope of the problems. And when we talk about collective giving, we're talking about energizing the public. We're talking about energizing anyone who is interested in change, to say that collectively, it's not only those resources, it's the attention, it's the understanding, it's the relationship building that happens within those collective giving circles with activists, with the issues that are impacting their community. Again, those are spaces that tend to also be very local. Tend to be, and that also is a world that's generally untouched by larger philanthropy. They're not interested in it. They just don't know it, right? And so being able to have that kind of proximity is really, really important. Is it better than kind of large philanthropy, the large foundations? I think that there's a role, and we believe there's a role for every kind of dot of light, in this world of moving dollars for change. It doesn't mean that there's not a role for experts, right? And when we talk about experts, we know that there's the kind of expertise that comes from having proximity and being close to those communities. But there's also a role for the Harvard educated economist, right? There's a role there, and we're not saying that the one is better than the other. It's saying let's be in relationship. Right. Let's be in relationship to the greater good that we're looking for. And let's make sure that there is a platform for those also who have expertise in terms of proximity. And that platform includes the collective giving, raising additional awareness, moving dollars together, and being able to collectively have a voice at the table when it comes to global strategies and how resources are moving.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and it touches, I guess, on what you mentioned earlier about sort of participatory models of grant making, and maybe the fact that historically a lot of them have their roots in kind of feminist and women's movements, and maybe they come more naturally to some of those groups, and now the wider philanthropy world is starting to perhaps get excited about them. On that sort of point about participatory methods, how much have you seen kind of what those groups that have maybe been doing that sort of thing for a long time, how much of what they know and what they've learned through doing it have you seen filter out into some kind of more mainstream or larger funders?
I love that I've been seeing this interest and growth, and I want to say rigorous evolution of what participatory grant making looks like and how it can be incorporated. I love that there's been additional and also infrastructure popping up to support it. I think that's fantastic. I still think we're a long way, though. I think there's when I look at where I'm seeing it in kind of the larger philanthropies, I'm seeing it as very, very tiny portion, very tiny portion of the investments are kind of being modeled under participatory, right? And there's a lot of different examples as to why. They'll talk about, it takes longer, it's more time intensive. But I don't know if, from my experience, when I'm these large institutions are taking 2 years to develop a strategy, I don't know that that's faster, right? Than kind of pulling together a set of movement leaders or people who are closest to an issue that they're looking to move a strategy around, and empowering them to iterate the strategy, to be in a decision-making role, to lift up organizations that are most effective within that strategy. I think it's there's still some room to challenge where some of those assumptions are. I love that there's additional interest. I think there needs to be a little more investment in that, where that interest is, to really start to be able to see how it might transform the sectors, some of our larger institutions. So I think they're just I guess it's a push and a call to just add additional dollars where the interest is following, to really see what it looks like being incorporated into a larger institution. But again, I'm happy to see the interest there, and that's a start.
Yeah, likewise, and I think that's a great call to action. On which note, I think before we wrap things up and I'll let you go, I just wanted to ask if you have anything particular coming up that you wanted to kind of alert people's attention to, or just generally give people a sense of what's coming up next for WFN.
Yeah, so I would just invite people to, again, think if they haven't heard about a women's fund before, what women's foundations are doing. There's probably one in their area, anywhere in the world. So I would just encourage people to be curious about what they do. They are, again, sitting in that in between activists and philanthropic world. They're a great bridge to both doing work and funding work. So I would encourage people to reach out and to learn more about them, and also know that they're doing amazing, innovative work under duress right now. They're doing it under duress. They're doing it under funding that has not grown since the 70s. And if there's an opportunity to additionally resource those organizations to lift up the work that they're doing within your own philanthropic practice, that would play an essential role in helping the field grow. And that they're concerned about the fight for gender equity and justice, and how that plays into all of the different intersections. Again, I would encourage them to look into that, encourage them to look into our organization and how they might get involved with a wide variety of women's funds around the world. And again, just stay curious about it and ask more questions.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll put links in the show notes to places where people can find some of that information. Just remains to say thanks ever so much for finding the time to come on the podcast. It's great to have a chance to talk and to hear about the work you're doing, and I wish you all the best for the future.
Thank you so much, Roger. It's really great to see you and talk with you.
Great. Okay, great. Well, my thanks again to Elizabeth for finding the time to come on the podcast. Really great to have a chance to talk to her about all of her work at WFN and kind of wider issues around feminist funding and gender equity. I'll put links in the show notes to some of the specific things we mentioned, and also some other articles that might be of interest, touching on topics that we talked about in the podcast. If you're interested more broadly in issues around philanthropy and civil society, definitely do check out the website at whyphilanthropymatters.com. You can find all kinds of articles, old issues of episodes of this podcast, news updates, and lots more on there. You can also find contact details where you can get hold of me if you've got suggestions for things that you would like to see on this podcast in the future, either in terms of topics you would like us to cover or people that you think it would be interesting for me to talk to. You can follow me on social media as well. I'm still just about on Twitter at Rodri_H_Davis. I'm more and more on LinkedIn, so you can find me there. I'm also on Threads and Blue Sky and Mastodon. Look for me there, although I'm not doing a huge amount with those at the moment. You can also leave us a nice review on iTunes or wherever it is that you get your podcasts, because that really helps to kind of spread the word. And if you want to spread the word yourself directly, do tell anybody that you think might be interested in this podcast about it and get them to try out an episode and see if it's for them. And other than that, I will see you next time. Okay, bye!